So hello everyone. This is the third video I'm posting on the A171 crash. The first one being on 21st June this year. What I've done now is going to present a few more results, connecting a few more dots by continuing my analysis of the data that I got from a video out there which I cited, the rooftop, taken by a teenager and posted on YouTube. So to summarize things, we all know that it was a case of omission where the pilots failed to notice the transition of switches from the run to the cutoff, just as it got airborne. Then they did notice it about 10 seconds later and started a correction by restoring back to run from cutoff. Now, some people might believe that this delay of 10 seconds between omission and correction might have been the reason for the crash itself. But I believe otherwise, because as you will see from this video, the entire thing was complete in the hands of fate from the moment it got airborne. And why I'm saying that is, fate granted this aircraft just 15 seconds. 15 seconds from the time they restored the switches to the collisions themselves. Now 15 seconds where? At just 625 feet height, that's about 190 meters, and at a very, very low speed, of course, because both engines had gone dead. And we are trying to bring back dead engines to life and continue flight all within 15 seconds, just within a few meters of the nearest chimney, tower and tree, right next to impossible. So anyway, let's see what I've got here in the video and how I've gone about it. So this is the link to my first video, the one I posted on 21st June, where I looked into the spectrogram of the audio data there, and I could identify the engine orders were falling. Now I do go back and bring out another audio amplitude versus time here as well, but this is on the UTC scale, the scale that the UTC time standard is one that's followed across the aviation industry almost everywhere. Now again, I get a PST on a dB scale as well here, a spectrogram, the PST being of course the superior character to anything else because it's a natural stochastic filter of power spectral density. It enhances a signal related to noise because signal is highly correlated. But the bulk of the things I'm going to talk about here are the high precision scalograms and high amplitude distributions that go with them. I'll explain what these are. These things cover the engine order speeds falling all the way from there up to the relight attempts ending, where the FADEC also aborts the relight attempts. And to complement this, I just have a very basic critical analysis of the rise of the APU power with time, again on the UTC scale. Right, so let's look at the time domain record first, from the data that I had used earlier in my June 21st video. So the red line you see here, this is the place where the highest amplitude of the audio is. And I have considered the EAFR recording, the 4 EAFR recording. There were 2 EAFRs in this aircraft, one in the nose of the aircraft, one in the aft of the aircraft. The one in the aft was found to have got so damaged that nothing came out of it. Fortunately, there was this EAFR at the front of the aircraft, the 4, which gave them some of the data that they could use, really bring out a report with. Now, I have considered that the recording stopped here. The time as per the report is 8:9:11, and I am assuming that the highest amplitude is that particular time. Now, you might ask me why I believe that is at time 8:9:11. Well, I have no way of proving it, of course, but the EAFR is a very high mil standard kind of system which can take a lot of high Gs, high temperatures, high pressures, and high stresses as well. So if at all we are seeing something stopping, recording getting stopped there, it's probably because one of those thresholds got exceeded. And where the amplitude is highest, I would expect some of these things to be really also consistent with that, a high amplitude, high stress or a high acceleration, which might end up causing the EAFR to stop recording. Right? So that's the best ballpark kind of estimate of the placement of the timestamp on this audio recording. Anyway, let's look at the other things that we can notice here. The engine order speeds are falling, of course, from 57 onwards, as you can see for a second. There are 2 there. The pilots, again, as you know, did a relight attempt, and again there was some rise in the amplitude, but again you can see that it is fallen because the FADEC aborts this. The FADEC, the full authority digital engine control, when it looks unfair on the part, and cruel on the part of FADEC to really abort and attempt to relight it, especially in an emergency like this. But you will see that the FADEC could do nothing, but that's the way it was trying to really fight with nature, which it couldn't do. Now, there's also something that I could spot here, the explosion of fuel rich air happening at 0904, which I didn't talk about in the previous video there. And then the mayday call at 0905, which of course came obviously because the pilots had run out of all options. They had tried their level best to bring up the aircraft again, and it was just in the wrong place, the wrong time, as I could put it, and had to, the inevitable, the collisions we see here from little before 0909 or whatever. So anyway, let's look at the spectrogram, and let's get to see things in a little from the engine perspective and so on. So this is the spectrogram. The one is the place the mayday call, of course, was given, the 0905 there. The two is where the recording stops. But what you do notice is in the left hand of the graph near 57 and going for about a second or two, are a lot of curves that are falling down to a level like this, scores one above the other. These are of course nothing but your engine orders whose speeds are falling down. I try to visually mark a few arrows there to help you track the orders as they are falling. Then of course there's a relight attempt that pilots started relights from 54 onwards, 854 onwards, so a little preceding this. But what you see in the spectrogram is things really spread out all the way up to 0903. So I have considered the relight scalograms, which I'm going to bring out later. I've gone all the way up to 04 in fact. Then there's, if you can very faintly look at the spectrogram, you'll see a faint line going all the way up to 3000 hertz, somewhere at 04. Try to locate it between that 1 mark, the mayday call, and the 03 mark, somewhere midway between them. You'll see a faint mark, and that's actually where the fuel-rich air explodes. I'll get a more closer picture of this in the scaleogram. All right, of course, the bottom line that you see is the faithful RAT that has been operating all the while. But of course, the RAT can only do so much. It's a very low power system that's meant to really try to bring up the major, wake up the major power source, the APU. But we'll also see why the APU couldn't do anything in spite of being woken up. Now, before I get to the scalograms, I just want to bring out an algorithm which I used for something I call the high amplitude distributions. Now, you know that a scalogram is a continuous wavelet transform, and it gives a matrix A that's a function of both the frequency and time. So what I do is to normalize this amplitude range and the A matrix to a 0 to 0.8 scale. Now, I just chose 0.8 because it works for me. There's no particular reason for 0.8 being there. And then this normalized matrix I call as A bar. I put it through this simple algorithm here. I create a vector NF equal to the number of frequencies in the A bar matrix, and there are the number of rows as well. But what I do is to generate a random number in the high amplitude regime. That's between 0.7 and 0.8. That's 0.7 to 0.8 is about 12.5% from the top. Now I'm looking for all elements of the A bar matrix that are in excess of this random number R. So they all belong to what I consider as the high amplitude of the CWT or the A bar matrix. Now the high amplitude is of interest to me when it's also going to be seen at a high frequency, which means it's kind of something that's belongs to the engine orders regime. So at the end of this process, whenever I find the matrix element being more than R, I increase the count associated with that particular frequency by 1. So I get an NF of K at the end of this run, which tells me how many times I am seeing a high amplitude at a certain frequency. So I go one step further. Now max normalize is enough to just get a 0 to 1 NF vector rather than some random large numbers showing the counts. Alright, so now let's look at the first scaleogram. And before I do, let me first tell you that I'm going to generate the scalograms in various windows. So this is the first 800 millisecond window. And this I call as the window of hope, 57.2 to 58. I took 57.2, not 57, because there was a bit of audio narration preceding this up to 0.2, so I just started from there. I call this the window of hope because you're going to see that there's a lot of engine orders that are present here in this particular window. So the first scaleogram in the frame, 0.2 to 0.25, 57.2 to 57.25 is here. So what you notice is, a lot of high amplitude is certainly seen at the sub 500 frequency, especially around the frequency of RAT, it's around 100 hertz. And you do see a lot of content again at 500 and a bit somewhere around 1000 to 1500 too. Now the best way to understand is not by just visual and verbal kind of descriptions, but rather by looking at the high amplitude distribution, which I just discussed the algorithm a while back. So the high amplitude distribution, if you look at the highest value here, in fact, that is obviously, of course, in the RAT, because RAT has been working faithfully, and it is the only thing that is obviously been audible throughout that recording of the mid rooftop. So you would expect that to have the highest amplitude there. Next, you see a couple of other peaks here, the little below 500 and a little past 1000. So these respective arrows also, you can see them marked on the scalogram there. These are, of course, the engine orders, because we know the RAT order is around 100 hertz. The rest of it has to come only from the engines, if at all. And what you notice is, of course, the engine orders are all well below the RAT's count. So what if you look at the sub 500 order for a figure here, for example, in the NF, it's somewhere around 0.5, which means that you see something like the 500 hertz only 50% of the time compared to 100% of the time that you see the RAT frequency. So it gives you a rough feel for how often an engine order is consistently seen in this particular window frame. Again, but by the way, this is just a 50 millisecond window frame, so it's not necessarily very suggestive of the long-term kind of character of the any of these phenomena like the engine order or the RAT being seen in the plot. So let's move to the next frame. It's now things have fallen down, unfortunately. They've come down to something like 20-25% on the engine side. They go up again, a little bit of peak again around 500 hertz. Little encouraging sign here. Again, these are reasons why I just decided to call this as the window of hope. Yeah, they keep going up at times. Sometimes, yeah, this is one of the strong ones that I could find things getting even up to 2500 hertz. In fact, up to, you see a strong presence here, even at 500, and also fairly kind of good presence even at the 1000, 2500 hertz. So it looks like at this point of time, maybe there was some serious attempt to come back. But again, things do fall. We'll understand why they really are falling rather than continuing to rise there on both the engines. So as we near the end of this window, we really are left with something like this kind of something like a 40% kind of presence of the high amplitude here around 500 hertz compared to 100% of the RAT. So the next, I call this as the window of fight back, but of course it was in vain, 58 to 59, the next second. So I'm just going to scroll a little quickly through the frames so that you can visually register the rises and falls as they happen. So you see a lot of sparsity as I'm going through, because the higher frequency range post 1000 to 2500 hertz is not showing too much of a consistent high amplitude there. It shows here, shows there, and unlike the RAT, you see throughout the lower ends always being present. So in fact, things are looking more sparse now as we move in time. It's not really looking very encouraging. You do see some content coming up at 2000 hertz here, but again, it's very momentary and not a very long-term thing. Sorry. So at the end of that, we are left with kind of thing that I consider that this was really a fight against time. Because 59 to 00, you again see the kind of things sparse character at the upper engine order regime. If you look at some of the places, especially now at between 0.25 and 0.26, you see a small cluster of high amplitude bursts there are between 500 and 1000, and similarly you see something like between 0.28 and 0.29 as well. I'll come back to this kind of bursts a little later and explain what they really are, why the engine didn't pick up on these and come up to full relight. So again, it's now looking more sparse in the last second, and as you can see, things aren't very looking in very bad shape for this aircraft. Yeah, they're now so bad that you don't even see things coming up past the 500 mark. Of course, there are two engines, and if at all you saw something, it's possible from the other engine. Okay, so things were getting worse for this aircraft, 9.1 to 9.2. I didn't put up the 0.0 to 0.1 because no point anyway looking at every second when you knew where things were going. So you do see some kind of the clusters and bursts out there at various, just for a few milliseconds, 5 milliseconds or so, which I'm going to explain in a while. So things again are continuing to look very bad for the aircraft here, as remember that this is now we're looking at 0901, and the collisions were somewhere around 0909, which means we are just about 8 seconds from collision. And just imagine this is the picture of things at that point of time. Certainly something that no human would be able to really live with. So I just call this as a hell that they were going through for obvious reasons. 0 to 03. Nothing seen here. Hardly anything to hold out even a slight amount of hope. Both engines are really now. Literally, the FADEC has cut off everything. FADEC is not doing anything at all. So these two bursts that I'm going to explain a bit here, which we have been seeing occasionally happening in various frames. So they are really, if you're wondering where they are, why they didn't end up being relight, that's because these are nothing but impulse responses, as we understand in structural dynamics. Now, what exactly I mean by that is, the impulse here actually comes from the injection of fuel and its subsequent explosion in the combustor. So that kind of burst of potential energy in the system turns into kinetic energy. If you want to look at it from the point of energy, which is the easiest way to look at it. So the energy that's got into the high pressure spool really ends up as an impulse, bringing up that momentary character of engine or blade passing frequency, say in the 500,000 range, but only for about say 5 milliseconds of this time. So these are all just impulse responses. So they are not really kind of indicative of any engine trying to come back from 500 hertz upwards up to 2500 hertz or whatever. Right, so you do see them here and there. Of course, again you see a couple between 0.67 and 0.68 and so on, but are just the impulses that are happening again between 0.78, 79 and such places. Well, we are now at the end of this window. Again, it was all but over out here in 03 to 04. Literally nothing happening, and anyone in this situation, I think, would not just, even the rat you can see is now, of course, partly if you see non-continuous presence of the rat frequency here, it's possibly also because the aircraft was quite far away from the microphone of the teenagers which was holding it. So there's a possibility that we are looking at something that's also diminishing in amplitude because of the distance. Right, so things are now almost it's all but over if you were to summarize this. All right, so there is, as I mentioned, kind of I could notice a fuel-rich mix explosion happening. And this is the one I'm going to highlight now here. This place where you're seeing between 0.04 and 0.05, you see a small kind of rise of the frequencies there. And in fact, this, if you go back to the spectrogram earlier in my video, you will see that it also, I was mentioning about this point there. So it gets all the way up to 3000 hertz. Now, why did this fuel-rich mix explode? Because, of course, the vapor there had a limit to its own stability of in a vapor state, and it had to sometime tend to explode out there. So it probably the threshold was crossed and the explosion happened. person, of course, who's an expert in this area might be able to give a more precise answer than I can. So I just was able to identify this, but the physics of this, of course, would depend exactly on what conditions were there in the combustor itself. So I take this up to 0.3 here, and then let's get to the question that we are $1 billion question. So, was a recovery ever possible at all in this aircraft? Could something have been done at all? The answer is sadly no. Now, to see why, let's start by looking at the power sources in this aircraft. So there are three sources of power, primary sources. Of course, I'm excluding the primary battery on the aircraft because I don't consider it as, in fact, a source at all. It's just there for very minimal functions, exceeding minimal functions. So the RAT, we all know, is the active power source that is the first responder that also responded here, and it kept going all the way until the collisions themselves. So, but the RAT can only do so much. It's only a 10 kVA kind of source, and that too when it's 10 kVA at its peak. And the A117 was certainly not flying to let the RAT operate at its peak either. So in fact, sub 10 kVA. But anyway, that wouldn't have mattered either way, because the real source that would have made a difference to the recovery, if at all, would have been the APU. The APU is the one that in fact is used to rev up the engines and bring them up on the ground when the pilots initiate the engine start sequence. But the APU can really come up only when the fuel control switches are in the run mode, not in the cutoff mode. So the pilots have to transition from cutoff to run in order for that to happen. So that's what they did. In fact, they did that at 08:52, and the APU inlet door, according to APU logic, opened 2 seconds later at 54. But you will see why things didn't end up the way they ought to have. The one would have wanted them to. There's a third source, of course, that's right on the engines, each engine, the VFSG, the variable frequency starter generators. These things, of course, make the two generators there give you totally cumulatively 500 kVA. But again, this is going to happen if really your engines are at full power. So in that state, the VFSG works in generator mode, giving you enough power to the aircraft. Else it's in starter mode, depending on power to operate, in fact, and that power from the APU. Right. So now let's look at on on-ground engine start. What happens here? So the critical thing to look at is something called HP compressor, the high pressure compressor. It's got multiple stages there, and its associated speed is what they call as N2 in the aircraft. There's also an N1 that's associated with the low pressure compressor spool. It's a little 4 of this high HP stage, HP compressor. Now the N2 is the crucial one because it is the one that determines the extent, whether the compression has gone to the right extent, the compression ratio has been achieved in order for the engine power to be really brought out as per the design of the engine. Now that transition from a state of being in the red to the green happens usually around the 21% mark. From whatever documents I have been reading on the net. So that happens to be around 2394 RPM here for a N2 max of 11,400 RPM. So what happens when the pilots initiate a startup sequence on the ground? The APU is switched on once they bring the switches to the run mode. The VFSG is in starter mode. But then this process is leisurely takes place over as the engine as the aircraft is being probably going through a pushback and such things. So during the pushback it slowly starts, and then once at the end of the pushback it's almost nearly near the transition mark of 21%, and they wait there till it really gets to the full green side before they start to really roll to the runway. So once they get to that full power of the engines, the APU goes off. Of course, the APU might have gone off a little earlier. I don't know exactly precisely where it goes off, but that's the FADEX call. And the VFSG, of course, in the generator mode. But the point is, the time it really takes to get from the red to the green here is cool 60 seconds, or probably 45 seconds to 60 seconds. That luxury of time is of course always available to the aircraft on the ground, and it also was available to this particular aircraft too, because obviously they did have a successful takeoff. There was no issue there. So now let's look what happens when it's airborne and how things are different there. So in a mid-air emergency engine relight, if you look at the same HP compressor's bar here, in this case, what has happened is the engines are dead, and instantly the rat comes on because the FADEC knows that something is off here, and you have to try to come back. So the rat comes on, but the APU comes on only after the pilots have set transition switches back to the run. So they do that about 10 seconds after the rat actually has come on. And of course, the VFSG2 does come on again because APU is now triggering the VFSG2 to get into starter mode. But here's the thing, that 2394 RPM is a crucial transition point. And if you cannot reach that, the FADEC aborts the relight. Now in this aircraft's case, it's obvious that it could never be reached. And that's obvious because the aircraft was at a low speed, a low altitude. There was no way it could even think of a windmill kind of start, which would have happened at some 30,000 or 35,000 feet. Because there you can even nosedive the aircraft if you are not really having the speed and really force the N2 to get past this 21% mark. But here, where were they? They were just above a few trees and chimneys, and no way they could even ever think of a windmill there. In fact, the aircraft was oriented this way, in fact, adversely for a windmill kind of possibility. But anyway, that's, the pilots were doing whatever they really should have been doing. They never did anything, went against the book. So it was just a case of fate and being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So things didn't work out right for this aircraft. And we'll see that again from this graph too. It's a kind of timeline of the rise of the APU power. So 8:42 is when the rat automatically gets deployed with the FADEC. 10 seconds later, the pilots notice the switch transitions have happened, corrected. It's 8:52. 54, the 2 seconds later, the APU inlet door opens. These time stamps are according to the report. You can get the report and see that they are there. And the APU starts its work, sending power to the VFSG to start revving up the engines. So the mayday call here is at 0905 and the collision at 909. So to the right of this collision, I've just shaded it because there's no point looking past the collision. But I still retain this because I want to bring up an important point here. Under ordinary circumstances, had there been no collisions, you would have expected the APU to have stopped its full gone off here at 0954 when the full power of the engine was reached. Right? Now, of course, how did I get this curve itself? That's again, it's the best fit to the 2 points, 450 kVA there on top, the 60 seconds time interval it takes for the APU to rise. And the time where it starts, I knew that. But what the point I'm trying to make is, there's a 61% kind of shortfall of power at the time of collisions. There's no magic that would have ever brought a 61% in an instant for the aircraft to really get out of where it was to obviously try and save itself. It was not possible. In fact, the shortfall would have been a little higher at mayday time, probably 70% there. So yeah, that's where things. That's the picture of things. Look, we have seen that throughout all the scalograms. We have seen that we see that here as well. So just to summarize, before I summarize things, let me just try to answer this important question. What if the pilots had restored the switches to run as soon as their transition cut off? Would that have made any difference? Yeah, this is a good question to ask, but sadly the answer is this. Had the switches been restored to run as soon as they had got transition to cut off, that would have, yes, given the APU another 10 seconds. So rather than get to full power by 954, it would have come to full power by 944. But then, collision was impending at 909 itself, way earlier. So that pilot's delay hardly mattered here. It was no issue at all because collision was the first that was destined to happen here. So let's summarize things now, what we have seen this far. So the engine orders we have seen, speeds have been falling to near zero by 08, 0858. The engines go dead there. The relight attempts are seen from 58 to 903, but the FADEC has been clearly aborting these attempts. And that's obviously because the way it's designed is to abort if the N2 is not adequate. Because the thermodynamic cycles of this gas turbine require that you achieve a necessary combustion ratio before injection and ignition. But of course, the injections, I'm not sure how they still continued for a long time, even though the FADEC had aborted attempts. I guess there's an independent option there, or the FADEC still allows you to do that for whatever it's kind of try what you can. So the only consequence of that was the fuel air mix was getting richer and richer, and at some point it crossed its threshold of stability as a fuel vapor and had to explode at 90404. So the pilots obviously, I'm sure, heard this and understood really that now they had nothing to do except they made a call. Well, unfortunately, this was a case of something that should have never happened so badly, especially giving no opportunity. It's a very unfair game, if you ask me. A very, very, very unfair game being played on the aircraft, the crew. It took them by total surprise with giving them 15 seconds really to come back from dead to life. Something just impossible. So this is an afterthought. I just couldn't help really thinking this about this. So if only really the FC switch transitions, the run to cutoff, if systems are designed so that these transitions are inconsequential during critical phases of flight, it's being very close to the ground, then there is a much higher possibility that engines would not shut down. Well, you might ask me, is there any exception to this at all? Yes, certainly there is an exception to this thing. If the engines, for example, are on fire, if an engine is aflame, then FADEC would recognize this and then allow you to really treat the transition as something that you really want to. So if pilots notice that there's a flame on his cockpit display on one of the engines, he has to obviously switch off that engine to avoid any major disaster there, because flame can spread and could explode there itself well before other things can be done. Alright, so I leave it with that, and I hope I do see things, that the report comes out recognizing the kind of points I made in my previous video on the transition, cause for the transition of the switches, the adverse vibration, the participation in the bounce mode, and the snap through the switches. But again, I have to wait and see what happens when the report comes and so on. I don't have any idea, a clue about when that's going to happen. So thanks for watching it so far, and let's hope things are going to get better in the aviation industry, not end up like this particular aircraft. Thank you so much.